Seated. Our journey of Lent continues, and it's hard to believe, but already it's the second Sunday in the Lenten season. It's also the first day of spring, and it's nice to be greeted with what is it? April showers, but it's not April yet. Well, we are looking forward to continue through Lent until we arrive at the great moment, the high holy days of the church year of Holy Week and Easter. But this is a time of preparation. This is a time of prayer and reflection. This is the time in which we take a serious look at our lives, an honest look, and to see how God has worked within our hearts and these lives in this past year. It is our prayer that the transforming work of God would continue in our hearts and lives as long as we have breath and as long as we live out the journey of our own lives here upon this earth. We are using the motif of the Lenten journey because it is a symbol or an analogy of how we experience life. Life is quite a journey. We are on the road of life. And two things about the journey of your life: even though you are on a unique journey, each one has their own journey, but you're not alone. You have traveling companions. You have those around you, your brothers and sisters in the family of faith, and you also have one who remains unseen, yet is truly and really present with you, and that is Jesus, because we walk with him as he makes this journey to Jerusalem. We too walk towards our own Jerusalem experience. We walk with Jesus to embrace death itself. We do so with the confidence that death is not the final curtain, that death has not the final word, that there is the promise of glory and of resurrection that follows. Everything is not as it appears. I believe that is the message of today's gospel, and that we are now brought to be focusing our attention and to be mindful of this reality. One of the disciples of Jesus who was there at the Mount of Transfiguration was a man by the name of John. And many decades after his experience on the Mount of Transfiguration and his time with Jesus, he wrote a letter. And in that letter, he addresses his audience with these words: "That which we have seen." Now, in the English text, that is a powerful statement as he goes on to develop his thought, that which we have seen. But unfortunately, the English language lacks the kind of tense that is there in the Greek in which he is writing. And so what he is really saying is something more like this: that which we have seen, and the vision of which has never left our minds. That which we have heard, and the ringing of which still remains in our ears. That which we touched and our hands have handled, and the sensation of which still remains upon our hands. This we declare to you. We beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son of God, full of grace and truth. And as John the Apostle wrote these words many years after his experience with Jesus on this earth, I think that John very much had this particular experience in mind of the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is one of those experiences that really elude the ability of human language to be able to try to capture or to recount. It is a moment of transcendence. Transcendence is something that happens in the human experience all too rarely, but when one has this experience of transcendence, when somehow that which is behind it all is briefly and for just a quick moment is gotten a glimpse of or experienced, then the world will never ever look us the same again. This is what the disciples, Peter, James, and John, experienced when they accompanied Jesus up to the mountain. Jesus, as you know, was someone who profoundly captured the imagination of his disciples. He was a fully human person, and yet there was something very mysterious about Jesus, because when the disciples were in the presence of Jesus, they felt as though they were in the presence of God in some mysterious way that they couldn't fully define. And the Transfiguration was not only a defining moment for his disciples, but it was also a defining moment for Jesus. Jesus had spiritual experiences, and this was one of them. You recall that Jesus had a tremendous defining spiritual experience in his life at his baptism at the Jordan River through the hands of John the Baptist. And at that moment, Jesus had a vision. And God speaks in the vision as the Holy Spirit comes upon him and says to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son. Upon you my favor rests." And at that moment, Jesus realized his identity and realized what his mission was in life, and so began that historic 3-year ministry that Jesus did in the ancient land of Israel. Now Jesus is having a similar experience. Before going to the Mount of Transfiguration, which happened about halfway through his ministry, or better than halfway, Jesus had learned of the death of his mentor, John the Baptist, who was executed by Herod Antipas. And this experience of the loss of his friend John so shook Jesus that immediately after hearing the news, he flees the country. He goes beyond the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas to the north in a place called Lebanon, or Phoenicia. And there, while he was a refugee in a foreign country, Jesus is reflecting on the question of his own identity and of his purpose and of his mission. So shaken he was by the death of John. And while Jesus was there with his disciples, he asked them a question. And the question's this: who do men say that I am? And the disciples came forth with a lot of prevailing opinions. All the talking heads had ideas about who Jesus was. And some said he's the prophet, Elijah, come back from the dead, or he's one of the other prophets, or he's this or that. And then Jesus looks intently at his disciples that were with him, and he says, "Yes, but who do you say that I am?" And then it was Peter. It's always Peter who speaks up and says, as he speaks for his fellow disciples, "Well, you're the Messiah. That's who you are. You're the Son of the living God. That's who you are." And then Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of John, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven." Now, when Jesus is having this dialogue with his disciples, we treat it as though this was another typical moment where Jesus is speaking rhetorically to his disciples and he's trying to teach them. But I don't think that was Jesus' purpose at all when he questioned them. I think Jesus was grappling with his own self-doubt, because Jesus was fully human. And to be human means to struggle with self-doubt, to struggle about your own identity and about your own purpose in life. Jesus shared in these things. As the writer to the Epistle of the Hebrews tells us, that Jesus was tempted and tested in all things. And just like any human being would be. And so perhaps as he was addressing his disciples, Jesus needed at this moment, this crisis, at this time of grief and loss and of fear, perhaps he needed his own reaffirmation. And so it was given to him. And it was Peter who affirmed him. And yet Jesus recognized that it wasn't merely Peter speaking, but it was his Father in heaven who was speaking through Peter. My brothers and sisters, most of the time, God speaks to you through other people. Have you noticed that in your experience? Someone may not even realize what it is that they're saying to you. They'll just make a casual remark in passing, but all of a sudden it strikes you right to the heart of your being, right to the depths of your soul, and you realize, even though that person doesn't realize it, they are speaking, but it is God who is speaking at a deeper level through them. It is not something that is coming merely from flesh and blood, but from the Father who is in heaven. That's why it's good that we listen to each other, because sometimes it may not merely be your wife that's talking to you. It may be God speaking to you. My wife would like for me to believe that most of the time. And so they ascended the highest mountain there in Galilee, which is called Mount Tabor, which is to the west of the Sea of Galilee. And when they came to the summit, all of a sudden they were there to pray. Jesus took three of his closest friends and intimates. That's Peter, James, and John, and they went to the mountain. And this is where we get the expression, having a mountaintop experience. Ever heard that expression? When we say we had a mountaintop experience, that means we had a defining moment of spiritual experience, an epiphany of some sort. And so Jesus had his mountaintop experience. This is taken right out of the Bible. This is a common theme, because Abraham went to the mountain and encountered the divine. Moses ascended Mount Horeb, or the Mount Sinai in the desert, and there on the summit of the great mountain, he met God. And so Jesus now is having his mountaintop experience. All of us have had experiences like this, and perhaps one is yet awaiting you. And as they were up there on this summit of this mountain, something funny and quite unexpected happened. Jesus was transformed before their very eyes. It is difficult when people have a spiritual experience, because spiritual experiences go beyond words. When language eludes us, then all we're left with is the experience that is beyond thought, beyond explanation, beyond comprehension, and difficult to articulate. I am struck by how simply told and straightforward are the gospel accounts of this experience of Jesus. In Mark's gospel, it says that Jesus' clothing became whiter than any launderer could possibly whiten them. Sounds like a commercial, doesn't it? For laundry detergent. You know, that, well, his clothes was whiter than anything that could be bleached that white. And not only that, but his face began to shine brighter than the sun. Now, this is very revealing, this insight by Mark, and that is that the sun, as you know, is the brightest light that we know in our experience. You can't even look at the sun. Or if you do, it's a very foolish thing to do, because the sun is so bright that it can blind you if you look at it long enough. The brightness of the sun is overpowering. And yet, on this day, the disciples saw something in the face of Jesus that even put a shadow upon the sun by comparison. Jesus' face and the divine life that radiated through the threads of his humanity was brighter than the created light that we see in the ordinary course of our daily activities. That the light of Christ, the uncreated divine light of Christ, is brighter than the light of the greatest star or even our sun, which is but a dim reflection of the divine light. This is what the disciples beheld when they said, "We beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten." They had to shield their eyes, I'm quite sure. And then, if that were not enough, all of a sudden two personages appear on either side of Jesus. There was Moses, and then there was Elijah. Jesus is flanked by these two great personages of ancient Jewish history. Moses the lawgiver, Moses who wrote the Torah, Moses who gave the foundation to a people and the nation of Israel, was there speaking with Jesus. And to his left was Elijah the prophet, Elijah, who was the greatest of all the oracles that came after Moses and challenged Israel. Those two personages were there, and Jesus was in conversation with them. Luke tells us that the topic of the conversation they were having with Jesus was his passing in Jerusalem, what his mission would be in his passion and in his death and in his resurrection. So as they were gathered there, the disciples so overcome by what happened, it is Peter again who speaks. He didn't know what to say, we are told. He says, well, this is a pretty good experience. You know how we like to bottle things and keep it. You know, when we have a spiritual experience, we just want to hold on to it. And so Peter's offered to build 3 tabernacles, 3 shrines here. This could be on a holy mountain. We can set up a booth here for Elijah, and one for Moses, and one for you, Lord, and we can start charging admission. Such is the way the human mind works. But Peter didn't get it. And as soon as he said that, they fell to the ground on their faces because a great cloud overwhelmed them and enveloped them. This great cloud, every Jewish person would understand what it meant. For when God spoke to Abraham, he spoke to him out of a cloud, a pillar of fire and smoke. When Moses went up on Mount Sinai, the mountain and the summit of the mountain was covered with a great cloud of glory. And the people at the foot of the mountain, the people of Israel, trembled in the presence of all the flashings of light and the great cloud that was on the summit of the Mount of God there in Horeb, where Moses received the law. And it also recalls the time when Solomon, centuries after Moses, built the great temple in Jerusalem. And when they dedicated the temple, the great cloud of God's presence came upon the temple, and the priests collapsed on the floor of the temple. They couldn't even lift themselves up. Just as the disciples now were prostrate upon the mountain of Transfiguration, they couldn't lift themselves up. They were overwhelmed by the glory of God. And the Jewish people had a term for this experience of this great bright cloud. They call it the Shekinah glory, the manifestation of the very presence of God. And what the story is saying is that to be in the presence of Jesus is to be in the presence of God. It is a manifestation of God. And then a voice spoke, like that at the baptism. But in the baptism, the voice spoke to Jesus. This time, the voice of God speaks to the 3 disciples. And this is what they hear. This is my son. This is my son, my beloved one. Listen to him. That is the will of God the Father, that the disciples of Jesus would listen to him. You've had Moses speaking to you for centuries now through the Torah and through the law. You have heard the oracles of the many prophets as represented by Elijah. But now it is time for you to listen to my son, my beloved one. For there is one far greater than Moses, one far greater than any of the prophets that now is among you, my son, my beloved one. Isn't this a powerful story? Jesus said to his opponents, you search the scriptures, thinking that in them you will discover everlasting life, not realizing that the scriptures, both Moses and the prophets, bear witness of me. And then, after this moment of transfiguration, all returns to normal. My brothers and sisters, the message of this story is really, I think, multifaceted, but there's one thing above all that we need to bear in mind, particularly as moderns living at the dawn of the 3rd millennium. Everything is not as it appears. There is a greater reality behind it all. At the Transfiguration, the disciples had a glimpse of that reality that is greater than the reality, the ordinary reality that we live in day after day. We are tempted to think that the only things that exist at all are those things we can perceive with our 5 senses. That's what is real to us. But there is a realm, a reality, if you will. Language eludes me at this point. There is a reality that is more real to the world that we constantly affirm in our ordinary sensory experience. There is something behind it all. There is a great story, a great narrative behind all the little stories of our lives. And there is a great reality that is all around us, and if we had eyes to see, we would be overwhelmed and we would collapse and fall upon our faces. And yet this reality is with us at all times. It wasn't like Jesus was visited by a light. He was always in the light. The disciples just couldn't see it. And yet they caught a glimpse when that moment came and their eyes were open, and that other reality, that which is more real and most real, was revealed to them. My brothers and sisters, as we continue together as companions on the journey of Lent, let us recognize that there is something more in your presence when you're looking into a face of another person. You're looking at a creature of indescribable beauty and light. You just can't see it at this moment. And that reality, if it was implanted within our hearts, would have an impact on how we treat one another. We would recognize that the whole creation radiates the glory of God. We would realize that we are called to be transfigured just as Christ was transfigured, and so participate with him in his eternal glory. We have beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son of God, full of grace, full of truth. May you behold that glory. May we behold that glory now as we come to the table, in which by appearance would only seem to be holding mere bread and wine. And may we behold the manifest presence of the Shekinah glory, the presence of God among us in Christ. Shall we stand?